is contended, but future Israeli President Menachem Begin, head of one of the Jewish terrorist groups or self-claimed terrorist group by the Arab nation, I'm not calling them a terrorist group, but that's what they call them, described as splendid and stated as, quote, as in Dear Hassan, so elsewhere, we will attack and smite our enemy. God, thou hast chosen us for conquest. Zionist forces committed 33 massacres altogether. At the end of the war, Israelis had conquered 78% of Palestine. 750,000 Palestinians had made refugees. Over 500 towns and villages had been obliterated, and a new map was drawn up, with every city, river, and hillock received a new Hebrew name, different from the Arab name, and all vestiges of Palestinian culture were erased. Some people will claim that this is ethnic cleansing, so the massacre of the Arab people and then the erasing of their culture falls in with ethnic cleansing, a genocide. Again, both sides will contend or argue this point, but that's up to you to decide. And for decades, Israel denied it existed as a population. Former Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir once saying, quote, there is no such thing as a Palestinian, end quote. In 1967, Israel still demanded more land. Following what was called the Six-Day War, the Israeli forces launched a preempted, highly successful surprise attack on Egypt. Israel occupied the final 22% of Palestine that eluded them in 1948, the West Bank and Gaza Strip. According to international law, it is inadmissible to acquire territory by war. These occupied territories do not belong to Israel, another contentious point between the Israeli state and the Palestinian state. The Israel also occupied parts of Egypt, which has been returned, and Syria, which remain under occupation to this day. Also during the Six-Day War, Israel attacked a US Navy ship, the USS Liberty, killing and injuring 200 American servicemen. President Lyndon Johnson recalled rescue flights, saying that he did not want to, quote, embarrass an ally, end quote. Though in 2004, a high-level commission chaired by Admiral Thomas Maurer, former chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, found this attack to be, quote, an act of war against the United States, end quote, a fact few news media have reported. Now, bringing you up to date with the current conflict, there are two primary issues at the core of this continuing conflict. First, there's a destabilizing effort to try and to maintain an ethnically preferential state, particularly when it's a large foreign origin. The original population, which is now Israel, was 96% Muslim and Christian, yet these refugees are prohibited from returning to their homes in the self-described Jewish state. People within this state also are still subject to systematic discrimination by the Israelis. Second, Israel's control of military occupation and confiscation of property owned in the West Bank and control over Gaza are extremely oppressive, with Palestinians having minimal control over their lives. Thousands of the Palestinian men, women and children are held in Israel prisons. Few of them have legitimate trials. There is physical abuse and torture by the Israeli forces. The Palestinian borders, even external ones, are controlled by Israeli forces. Men, women and children are strip searched. People are beaten. Women in labour are prevented from reaching hospitals, which can result in the death of the child or even the mother. Food and medicine are blocked from entering Gaza, blocked and restricted. There is an escalating humanitarian crisis. Israeli forces invade almost daily, injuring, kidnapping, sometimes killing inhabitants. According to the Oslo Peace Accords of 1993, these territories were supposed to finally become a Palestinian state, though after years of Israel controlling and confiscating land and conditions with conditions steadily worsening, the Palestinian population rebelled. The uprising called Intifada, which means in Arabic shaken off, began at the end of September 2000. The US has been involved, largely due to special interest lobbying. US taxpayers give Israel an average of $10 million per day since its creation, and more US funds to Israel than any other nation. Many Americans are now calling for the Israel expenditure and support to end. Now, to contrast the points from either side, I think it's important we look at both labels. On one end, we've got the far extremist Zionists, and the other, the Hamas terrorists. I think the majority of people both live somewhere in the middle, and labels and attributing either one side or the other to the whole population, Israel and Palestine, is fruitless. It's not going to work. There needs to be a middle ground in dialogue. Everybody's after peace ultimately, and that's what they need to work for. I think it's important that Hamas should stop the rocket attacks. It's difficult to say due to the occupation and the lives of Palestinians are leading because of the blockade that we've got whataboutery or yes but what needs to be stopped is the rockets. It's simple. Hamas should be condemned for their violence. The rockets, the indiscriminate firing that puts Israeli civilians at risk, unconditionally they should stop. The conflict, it's important to realise the conflict is older than Hamas. As a result, Israel should stop addressing the problems as a 27-year conflict. This conflict has been going on for 65, 67 years. So it's Hamas in recent years has proved the problem, but the roots go back even before Hamas even came into existence. Israel must stop blaming Hamas for the root of all problems, because the problems are there before they started also. So that's important to recognise. So to sum up, Hamas is the symptom of the conflict, but not the root cause of the conflict, and Israel need to recognise that. There are claims that Palestinians are inherently anti-Semitic. This is untrue, and Palestine's historical actions prove otherwise. Before the Israel nation creation, Palestine willingly accepted some 700,000 Jewish refugees escaping World War I and World War II and the Holocaust. This is a massive number considering Palestinians' Muslim population in 1947, and this was only around 1.2 million. That said, Palestinians did not vote for the creation of Israel. Israel's creation was imposed on the Palestinians by the United Nations. One of the main talking points is no country on earth would tolerate rockets raining down on its civilians. No doubt that's true, and I'm sure in the Western first world countries this would be also true, but in fairness, we also need to accept no country on earth would tolerate being split into two without the right of self-determination or a say in the matter. So if in America, if Canada, if the UK, suddenly we had an influx of refugees, and then the UN stepped in and said, right, we're going to split the country now. The new refugees are going to be self-determinant, and that this is their new country, and you've got to like it and lump it. So we need to start thinking about that too. So Palestinians did serve as a safe haven for Jewish refugees before the creation of the Israeli nation. So it's important to draw on the history and find the common ground between now and the future. Another key point is since Israel was created by the United Nations, it must live by the United Nations. So a hardline pro-Palestinian argument, especially by Hamas, states that since Palestine never approved the creation of Israel, they will not recognise Israel. The pro-Israel side states the opposite. The United Nations created us by democratic vote, so we are here to stay. If Israel is right, the reality is we cannot undo history. Israel has a right to exist, and it is here to stay, and no amount of arguing or fighting will undo that. A nation born by the UN must live by the UN. Since Israel's creation, the United Nations has passed at least 42 resolutions against Israel for violating international law, 17 of which are passed before Hamas existed. These include resolutions condemning Israel for illegal practices against civilians in Lebanon, condemning Israel's contravention of the 4th Geneva Convention, calling on Israel to withdraw from all Palestinian territories, calling on Israel to recognise the Palestinian right of return, and calling on Israel to respect Muslim holy places. Post-Hamas, the UN has passed resolutions against Israel to be abided by and accepted the 4th Geneva Convention, condemning Israel's invasion of Lebanon, condemning Israel's killing of UN employees of the World Food Programme, and condemning Israel settlements established since 1967 as illegal, all of which has nothing to do with Hamas. This reinforces the point that Hamas is not the root cause of this conflict. Israel has asked the United States and agreed to veto all 42 of these UN resolutions. Israel cannot have it both ways. It cannot, on one hand, claim legitimacy by citing the United Nations decision to create Israel and then ignore UN enforcements to hold Israel accountable to international law. If UN decisions are invalid now, and then they are invalid at Israel's creation. Likewise, and reasonably, since UN decisions were valid upon Israel's creation, they must be valid now, and Israel must maintain justice accordingly. Furthermore, no justification exists for civilian deaths. The concept of self-preservation or zero-sum game does not work in any global village or by any moral compass. The idea that Arab blood is more valuable than Jewish blood, or that Jewish blood is more valuable than Arab blood, is modern-day racism and all its ugliness. A Palestinian child has just as much right as an Israeli child, and vice versa. Any action on either side that ignores this principle is a violation of human rights and derails the peace process. Let us rid us of the cancer of justifying collateral damage and recognise that all human life is equal. Also, all sides have committed potential war crimes and must be held accountable accordingly. Having elected Hamas, Palestinians must be accountable to Hamas war crimes. The firing of rockets indiscriminately is a war crime. Iron Dome and the comparatively fewer civilian Israeli casualties acknowledge fire rockets at a civilian population is by definition a war crime. Just because not as many civilians of Israel has been killed does nothing to mitigate the fact that firing rockets at a civilian is a war crime. Also, Hamas cannot hoard illegal weapons in UN schools, especially near refugees, and pretend they are not putting innocent Palestinians in harm's way. Such crimes does nothing to promote peace and only aggravate an already volatile situation. Hamas must immediately cease such acts. Israel must be accountable to UN nations and international law. Israel's use of white phosphorus is a war crime. Their use of human shields is a war crime. Israel's collective punishment of all Gaza is a war crime. Israel's targeting of killing of children on a beach playing soccer is a war crime. Israel's bombing of hospitals is a war crime. These are documented acts by the US mission reports, independent journalists, and by admission of Israeli soldiers. Rather than just ignoring these unjust acts, Israel must own up to their war crimes and immediately cease such acts. America and worldwide Muslim leadership has a massive responsibility here. Since Israel's creation nearly 7 decades ago, the world had witnessed the same violence over and over again. Several peace treaties and efforts has gone by, yet we stand no closer to peace. The Americans' reputation to the rest of the world, and especially the Muslim world, is that of a disloyal thug who enforces its will and